is very good. The swing works, the oracle again.
And the Yorker bowled in. That is out. Great theatre, magnificent drama.
First match of the season, eh, Howard?
First match of the season, Martin.
King Willow's on his throne and all's right with the world.
Gods and Flannelled Fools. It's from a poem about cricket.
Oh, very apt. How does it go on, my old Howard?
That's the only line I know.
Oh, but never mind, you certainly made the point.
Hello, and welcome to Gods and Flannelled Fools, Episode 6, Timeless Tests. This is the series in which I walk through a history of English Test match cricket, focusing on key series, matches, players and teams of a particular interest, basically exploring the myths and legends of the game that collectively have led to how we view Test match cricket today. If you haven't already listened, my pilot episode, A Brief History of the Game, up to the very first 2 Test matches in 1877, is available, as well as the first 5 episodes, in which I discuss the birth of the Ashes in 1882, the Great Ashes series of 1902, the legendary Sydney Barnes, the great opening partnership of Hobbs and Sutcliffe, and then the Bodyline series of 1932 and 1933. So worth checking those out on my channel. There's a Twitter profile for the series at GFFpod, and I'll also be making some notes in support of this on the blog, which is available at godsandflannelledfools.blogspot.com. I've had a few questions about forthcoming episodes, and it is my intention to continue this, focusing on at least one series or one particular individual in each decade, running all the way through to the present day. So if you have any requests, please send them in, and always happy to hear from people. So we start this episode 6, having covered the ebb and the flow of the Ashes battles following the Great War, and of course some of the key names in this period, including the batting exploits of Hobbs and Sutcliffe, the captaincy of Douglas Jardine, and the bowling of Harold Larwood. However, arguably the standout English batsman of this period requires more than just a passing mention, and I refer, of course, to the great Wally Hammond. Now, when I was young and watching England bat in Test matches in the 80s and then the 90s, any hundreds made by the likes of David Gower, Graham Gooch, or later on by Atherton, Stewart or Vaughan, would often evoke a graphic on the TV screen with a list of the leading scorers of Test hundreds. And this would encourage me to really yearn for whoever it happened to be scoring the 100 to creep further up the list. I was always keen for records to be broken and very much in the contemporary, but sadly this never seemed to take place. At the very top of the list, seemingly scribed in stone, were 3 names, and it seemed like those 3 names were there forever: Boycott, Cowdrey and Hammond. The first 2, though both retired at the time, had essentially played in a relatively recent era and therefore were sort of within living memory. Hammond, however, was a far more distant name, a batsman, you might say, of the exotic past.
That is very good. The swing works, the oracle again.
Walter Hammond was born in 1903, the son of a soldier who was posted to Hong Kong when he was 5 and then on to Malta before heading back to England, where the family settled in Cirencester in Gloucestershire. The young Walter Hammond picked up a cricket bat at an early age and became used to using heavy adult equipment, which helped in his eventual ability to strike the ball really powerfully. Hammond was a talented sportsman. He excelled at football and fives as well as cricket, and his headmaster personally wrote to the captain of Gloucestershire County Cricket Club advising him to offer a trial. At the age of 17, he scored 60 on debut for Gloucestershire, and then subsequently secured a professional contract with the county, although he flattered a little to deceive in the first couple of seasons, and actually ended up playing some football for Bristol Rovers. Such was the uncertainty around his cricketing future. In the 1923 season, however, things clicked into place, and he began making hundreds as well as taking a few wickets with his medium-pace bowling, leading some people to believe that he had a future as a genuine all-rounder. He was eventually selected for his country as part of the MCC tour to the West Indies in 1925 to 26. But the West Indies didn't quite have test status at this time, so he wasn't technically able to make his England debut. And in fact, the biggest, most significant thing on that tour was that he fell ill as a result of a mosquito bite towards the end of the tour, which really incapacitated him for quite some time, and it was very serious. It resulted in multiple operations. The doctors even thought they might have to amputate his leg at one point. Hammond subsequently missed the following season, and there were rumours for the rest of his life that the medicine used to cure him in the Caribbean had caused a change in personality that led to him being moody and prone to depression. He returned to cricket in 1927 and experienced immediate success, scoring over 1,000 runs in May, which many people will understand is a significant milestone in the English county season. And indeed, he scored nearly 3,000 runs in the full season, making his debut for England in the process, and then being selected for the tour to South Africa that followed. Whilst he didn't overly impress, and many understandably felt that he was still recovering from his earlier illness, he repeated his dominance in the following domestic season and then really came into his own during the 1928-29 Ashes tour that followed. Now, I made earlier reference to this particular Ashes tour on the Hobbs and Sutcliffe episode, but Hammond was a really dominating feature throughout, scoring 905 runs at an average of 113 in the series, something that really puts Alistair Cook's achievement into perspective from a few years ago. And during these tests, he ceased to play his favoured hook and cut shots on these quick wickets, instead playing most shots down the ground, and was by the end of it regarded as the finest batsman in the world, a status that he cemented over the next couple of seasons, during which time his phenomenal form really just continued. Now, in 1930, this status as the world's leading batsman was challenged and then ultimately surpassed by the emergence of a certain Don Bradman. And whilst Hammond continued to perform and score hundreds, his international standing fell backwards somewhat given the consistency of Bradman, and then one or two chinks that came into play, such as a perceived slight weakness against leg spin, plus, of course, distractions such as the controversy of the Bodyline Tour in 1933. One record of note during this period, and again one that comes up on the TV screens from time to time, was his innings of 336 not out, which included a then record of 10 sixes in a single test innings. And this remained the highest test score until Len Hutton broke it, although it did go under the radar due to the perceived lack of quality of the New Zealand bowling. In the 1930s, Wally Hammond went through a succession of illnesses and injury that ultimately resulted in a loss of form. In 1936, he had an operation to remove his tonsils, which, coupled with the resolution of a serious back injury, seemed to solve the problem finally. And he then returned to the England side, being made captain in 1938.
Hammond hits a six, and the last stroke has been played in the 1932-33 Test matches. There is a sparse attendance of spectators for the finish of the fifth Test, and no big scenes when Hammond and Wyatt make their way back to the pavilion.
One thing I've touched on in previous episodes is the concept that still held true in those days of amateurs and professionals. Ostensibly, the only difference between these two statuses was remuneration. Both types of players could receive bonuses and pay, but only professionals who were officially contracted to their clubs would actually draw a salary from their participation in the game, whereas the amateur was merely playing for the love of the game. However, the bigger deal with this was really the class status, which was that amateurs tended to be viewed as having a higher social status, and this went back to the days of gentleman versus player games in the 1800s, when high-ranking army officers and senior employers in industry would hold distinction when it came to participation in sport and selection on teams. This, you might say, archaic practice began to fade out after the war. And in fact, the concept of the amateur status was finally abolished in 1962 by the MCC. But there were some interesting ramifications of this through the years. When it came to the role of England captain, for instance, in the early years of the Ashes, there were one or two professionals selected to lead the MCC touring party, but only because they were set up as private ventures and funded as such. For the most part, through to the 1950s, in fact, England captains were amateurs as an unwritten rule, as the concept of gentlemanly play sort of held fast. Of course, this notion grew, you could say, somewhat absurd during the Bodyline series that I covered in the last episode, because I think anyone would struggle to make the argument that what Douglas Jardine did was gentlemanly, whether you agree with his approach or not. So in any case, when it came to the 1938 English cricket season, with a number of leading people in the authorities pushing for Wally Hammond to become English captain, he took amateur status with Gloucestershire, was elected to life membership of the MCC, and became captain of his country, something that many felt was long overdue. His first series against Australia resulted in a 1-1 draw, and though his captaincy was criticised, especially for his handling of his spin bowlers, he continued his prolific run scoring, showcased in the final test of the summer, where England amassed an extraordinary 903 for 7, which was a record for many years until Sri Lanka reached 952 for 6 in 1997.
He sends in number 9 on his batting list, Verity, to open with Barnett. And look what Verity's done to Fleetwood Smith. 3 runs there, O'Reilly to Hammond. Doing this for the great Walter, but big Bill O'Reilly's in terrific form and keeps all the stars quiet as mice.
Following this, Hammond then captained the MCC on a 5-match tour to South Africa, a series criticised for slow play by both sides and generally a reluctance to force results. However, the series is best known to this day for containing the last timeless test to have been played. Now, there were 99 timeless tests played up to and including 1939. Most of them occurred in Australia, and many were decided upon if the series was in the balance going into the final match, rather than being pre-scheduled. Given that many tests were scheduled over 3 or 4 days in this period, the mental and physical discipline to be able to bat and then take the field for such a prolonged period of time was really quite intense, and it's perhaps no wonder that most sides would take an overly cautious approach to batting, which would result in innings being strung out with rather low scoring rates. In this particular series against South Africa, the first 4 tests had been quite dull and very negative, with England having won the second test in Durban to take a 1-0 lead. The final test, also played in Durban on the 3rd of March 1939, was to be timeless. And what transpired proved to be the final nail in the coffin for this long-forgotten format of the game. South Africa won the toss and chose to bat, scoring 530 in a massive 202 overs. You just imagine watching that take place. And England replied with 316, and then South Africa made 481 in their second innings at a slightly quicker rate, which set England a massive 696 runs to win the test. Now, Ordinarily, when one thinks of a target of this magnitude being set in the present day, the best case scenario that you would imagine playing out would be to avoid a crushing defeat, first off, by putting up a stout effort. And if there were less than a day's play remaining, then you would look to see it out in a draw, if possible. In this case, however, there were no time limits, so England set about chasing the massive target down, really determined to apply discipline in their efforts. The trouble was that rain had affected the match throughout, and together with a rest day being thrown into the mix, the game crept into the 12th day. 12 days. You can't imagine it now. And despite hundreds from Wally Hammond, from Gibb and Edrich, they were still 40 runs off the target when they reached 654 for 5, having scored at 2.2 runs and over. And their boat was due to leave back for England. It was pre-booked, or their tickets were pre-booked. So both sides ultimately had to agree to a draw. Frustratingly, this highly impressive fourth innings effort was not enough to register as a successful run chase in the history books, as I say, because I didn't quite get there. And indeed, it would be the last ever timeless test, because after a shortened home series against the West Indies following this tour, the outbreak of World War II would keep Test cricket on hiatus until the following decade. And by which time the concept would ultimately be regarded as impractical, both commercially and logistically. 5-day tests would then become the norm, with a small number played over 4 days until the early 70s. And most tests, of course, would incorporate a rest day, which was a practice that would continue through to when I first started following cricket in the 1980s.
And the Yorker bowled in. That is out.
Great theatre, magnificent drama.
So what became of Wally Hammond? Well, he joined the RAF during the war, losing much of his career to those years before resuming cricket back in 1946, when he captained England for 2 final years before finally retiring in 1947. He finished with 7,249 test runs at an average of 58.46 with 22 hundreds, a record for an Englishman only surpassed subsequently and much later on by Alistair Cook and Kevin Peterson. Indeed, for many years he was the batsman to which all subsequent stroke makers would be judged, and the likes of Hutton, May, Gower and Vaughan were often referenced against the great Wally, perhaps only Peterson eventually reaching a parallel for attacking play during the course of his career. He was regarded by his contemporaries as one of the 3 greats of the era, along with Bradman and George Headley of the West Indies. But his stroke play was perhaps the most elegant, especially his driving on the offside. If he hadn't been so reluctant to bowl, it was felt by some that he could have been a genuine all-rounder, but he was never prepared to take bowling that seriously. As he moved into his post-sporting life, I should say, Hammond became an elusive figure. He was regarded by some people as a snob. He was never great with money, and he married twice, his first marriage having ended in divorce. In the 50s, he moved to South Africa with his family, and after a tumultuous succession of personal issues, suffered a heart attack and died in 1965. So as I bring this episode to a close, with it really draws to a close an era of the game that was taken away with the outbreak of World War II, much in the same way that the Great War brought the curtain down on the golden age of the game. The Second World War ended some of the idiosyncrasies, perhaps, that I've described, including, of course, timeless tests and the gentlemen and players concept that went through to amateurs and professionals. In the next episode, I'm going to cover another Ashes series that took place following the end of the war that would prove to be the final outing for an ageing Don Bradman, but at the same time ushered in some new legendary names for the Australian side, something that made for a somewhat unhappy summer for the English cricket team. Until then, Thanks for listening and subscribing to Gods and Flannelled Fools. Goodbye.